word of prayer. Penny, can I ask you to praise?
Dear kind and gracious Heavenly Father, we come before you this blessed Sabbath day, and we want to thank you for the opportunity that we have to come here and worship and to learn of you. We bless each and every head that is bowed, and we ask blessings on everyone. And please be with Sister Madison as she prepares to give us the Sabbath school lesson. In Jesus' precious name, amen.
Amen. Okay, we are on lesson 12 in the quarterly. And just to preface it, in case some of us haven't gone through the lesson, I'm going to read the first couple of sentences of the first paragraph on page, I think it's 96 in the Standard Edition. Ezra and Nehemiah became leaders in communities in which intermarriage with non-Israelites had become the norm. Both leaders were strongly concerned about this, as they wanted to lead the nation into a close relationship with God. So we're going to look further into how they handled the issue of intermarriage. And we'll move on to the first lesson on Sunday. If I could have somebody read Nehemiah 13 verses 23 to 25.
We have the mic.
Nehemiah 13 verses 23 to 25.
I'll read it.
Okay.
Let's get the mic.
Nehemiah 13, 23 to 25. In those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab. And their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves.
So the question is, what happened here, and how do we explain Nehemiah's reaction to the situation? I want to encourage participation. So just if anybody, yes, Larry?
Was it a form of humiliation
Get the
and
mic.
wanted to,
Oh, I think we're gonna pass the mic around.
was it a form of humiliation that he plucked the hair out so everyone would know who had a foreign wife?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we go down to the middle of the first paragraph on that page, it says, however, since the mothers were from Ammon, Ashdod, and Moab, and were generally the primary caregivers for the children, it is not surprising that the children didn't speak the languages of the fathers as well. The language we speak informs that the way we think about concepts, because we use the vocabulary of that culture. Loss of the biblical language would have meant losing their special identity. Thus, for Nehemiah, it was unthinkable that families were losing touch with the Word of God, and consequently their connection with the living God, the Lord of the Hebrews. So people were losing their connection because of their spouses that they chose to intermingle. Does anyone? Yeah, Bob?
I just wanted to add that when you look at, there was very, very specific counsel given to God's people for them to not be intermarrying and to do these things. And so it's a direct violation of the covenant of what God is asking them to do. And God knew that if they would, the reason he said that, it wasn't just arbitrary. It was so that they wouldn't enter into a compromise and be exposed to practices and things and that weren't right, and that they could actually, follow God. And obviously, if there's even becoming a language barrier, then that even further separates the children, the next generation, from being able to be following the Lord in the way that they need to, and to be able to be studying His Word.
Yeah, exactly. And then if we go down to the second paragraph, it states that public shaming was an acceptable form of punishment in these times. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Would that be acceptable nowadays? And then I guess the next question would be, how should we react when we see what we believe is wrongdoing in the church? If anyone has any thoughts to share? And Jim wants the mic. You could pass it back there.
Just a short answer is that that was a one-time situation for back then.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have application for today.
Yeah. Anyone else? Roman?
Just a short comment, but okay. I think yeah, it can be taken out of context to try to justify public shaming today, but
Mm-hmm.
that was supposed to be a theocracy, God directly leading the Israelites, but today the United States is not intended to be a theocracy.
Yeah. Suellen?
Well, I'm sorry to say I haven't read the list,
That's okay.
but I wasn't gonna really make this comment, but, I think that, as far as intermarriage now, in those days, there was the language barrier between in different nations, but, primarily the purpose was to, marry someone who believed in God
Mm-hmm.
and God's commandments, and so there were times, and actually they were supposed to be sharing this message with the world and bringing other people to God. So there were cases, I'm sure, where people were from other nationalities, or maybe they even met someone who was another nationality but had converted to this, and I think that was the primary purpose, was for everyone to be there, because we have other examples throughout the Bible where people were converted, like Ruth and others. So I don't think we should just think of it as not intermarriage outside of because they're a different nationality, but not intermarriage because they didn't share the same love of God.
Mm-hmm.
And and I don't think public shaming is appropriate now, and I think we learn more through the Bible, especially when you get to the dispensation of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
that's not appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I just wanted to add just a little. It just says down here that that it was, the public shaming was for some of them, which ended up they're saying was the leaders,
Right.
and they
Mhm.
were punishing them. He was punishing them because they were promoting
Mm-hmm.
or
Mhm.
even causing this wrong behavior. So
Mhm.
that's who was really getting
Yeah.
publicly shamed.
Yeah. Bob?
If we in any way want to try to compare public shaming with the dispensation we're living in,
Mhm.
we have to realize that back then, because of the theocracy and because it was considered acceptable to do that when people were, out of line
Mm-hmm.
and doing things wrong. And so I know that in our society today, there's laws that we have, even civil laws, there aren't
Mhm.
even God's laws, and I know that for God's laws, we're not doing anything like that to people,
Mm-hmm.
but there are consequences
Yeah.
when people do things, and people know what the consequences will be. But I think a lot of times people, it's human nature for us to think, well, I can do this and maybe I won't get the consequence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, God wants us to read from cause to effect and know that there are consequences for everything,
Mm-hmm.
so.
Sorry. Anyone else? Penny?
I think that we do have public shaming in this day and age.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you look
Yeah.
online, I mean, you can even look at our president who tweets
Mhm.
and publicly shames and humiliates
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, it has reached us at the highest level.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Good point. Yeah. We'll move on to the next day, Monday. And then if I could have somebody start by reading Nehemiah 13 verses 26 and 27.
Okay. Nehemiah 13, 26 and 27. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. Shall we then hearken unto you to do all this great evil, to transgress against our God in marrying strange wives? Did I go one more?
Okay, good. Okay. And what does this show us about how important biblical history is for informing us about the dangers of deviating from the right path?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess we can go down to the first paragraph. I'm going to read, it's about halfway down. Solomon's life is used as a negative example. Not only did he marry more than one wife, but significantly, as Nehemiah points out, he chose women who were not worshippers of God. Then we'll go down to the next question. Why was Nehemiah correct in reproving the nation for intermarriage with pagans? And if I could have somebody read Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Jim? I think we have a hand over here. Jim? Do you wanna read?
Genesis 6, 1 through 4. In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw...
What
I'm reading the wrong verse here.
Oh,
Chapter 6, 1
Chapter
through 4.
6.
Sorry about that. Okay, let's try it again. Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And it came to pass when the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and the daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, the same became mighty men, which were of old, men of renown.
Wonderful, you're good. And then if I could get another volunteer to read Genesis 24, verse 3. Roman?
Genesis 24, 3. And I will make thee swear by the Lord, the God of heaven, and the God of the earth, that thou shalt not take a wife unto my son of the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. But thou shalt go unto my country, and to my kindred, and take a wife unto my son Isaac.
Thank you. Okay. Does anyone have anything to add? Our question was, why was Nehemiah correct in reproving the nation for intermarriage with pagans? Bob?
I'm going to tie it back with what we just mentioned when we were looking at Solomon
Mhm.
as well. Obviously, when you look at Genesis, the classes of people, as there's always two classes of people.
Mhm.
You have those who were sons of God. They were actually following God and wanting to uphold the truth and live the truth.
Mhm.
And you had the sons of men, who were those who were defying God and walking their own way,
Mhm.
and which defines the classes between Cain and Abel.
Mhm.
And so, when it says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, that's when they started to do the intermarrying.
Mhm.
Do that, and God knew this was wrong, because you have people that have different ideologies, different methodologies, if you want to even say that, who are trying to blend together, and there is no blending between God, between Christ and Satan.
Mhm.
You're either on one side or you're on the other,
Mhm.
and that line has been blurred so much so over the years. And when you look at Solomon as an example, I see Solomon, so he was the king, and he had humbled himself so much before God, and that God gave him so much wisdom. Doesn't matter even how much wisdom you have, even if his motives initially were right, he was thinking, I believe, he was thinking that if he married and had association with all these heathen women, that he would actually be able to be an influence on them to bring them to, the God of Israel. And yet it had quite the opposite effect, and ended up drawing his heart away. And because he was the leader, a whole bunch of other people followed, and there's a lot of counsel and words given to us in inspiration to tell us that the whole nation was led into apostasy. And it was only when Solomon was an old man that he recognized the mistakes that he had made and how far he had gone in the wrong direction, how far he had led the whole nation in the wrong direction. And even though he was at a place where he was repentant, he couldn't stop the trend of the whole nation following in that practice of intermarrying, which
Mhm.
was, again, just helped lead down the steps downward. So we're talking about a really, really important principle,
Mhm.
that we don't become unequally yoked with those that don't already agree and understand God's word, in principle, using the methodology we have.
Thank you. And I just wanted to add to that and highlight one important point that's in the lesson. If you go to the first sentence below that question, the command not to intermarry was not about nationalism, but about idolatry. I thought that was really interesting. And then we'll go down to the next question.
Got a hand.
Yes. Where? Sorry.
I guess my question would be, did the women really have a choice to marry the Israelites? And if you look at the side of the women, they were heathen, they didn't know the same God. But yet when they were publicly shamed, could they say, no, I don't want to marry you? But I'm guessing that they were probably forced, and so they had children. So you got to think about the other side of it. They didn't know the same God, yet they were persecuted because they married. There's another side where you feel bad about what the women had to be feeling. I guess I don't know how to explain it, but the women and children in fear, because now all of a sudden they're getting publicly shamed. And why? Because that's the way, I don't know. I just see that side also,
Mhm.
that the Israelites went after these women, and these women were, I don't know if I'd say innocent bystanders, but they didn't worship the same God. That's not right, but I know that this was a different dispensation.
Does anyone else have anything to add? If not, we'll go down to the question at the bottom. Does anyone have any thoughts on it? What principles can we take from these accounts today that can help us protect our faith and that of our family? Larry?
As far as principles that we can take that accounts today, coming into the Adventist faith at 30 and being single, and to follow that. And if you didn't meet someone in college, in Adventist college, or if there wasn't an availability of ladies that you met in church, I could see that, how that gets can be a little complicated in your choosing or something, because where most people meet at work or through school, and I saw it, but I know that in the Adventist conference they have a dating system where you can meet other Adventists, and so there is an avenue for that. I don't know if this movement will ever come to that. If that would be helpful, but people that want to be married, I don't know. But and then I also saw the negatives of it. I had a friend that was in the dating system, Adventist dating system, and he went to meet a lady out of state, and as they were going to restaurants or just talking and walking in the park, he always knew that there was another man following him or something, or the eyes on him. And so later, when he left the girl, well, she brought him all the way to another state because her parents were so strict that they wanted the daughter to marry an Adventist man, and she had an affection for a worldly person. So to please her family, she went into the dating thing, and yeah, it was kind of hard on the guy that went all the way out there. I had a friend that went all the way out there, but so it can get a little complicated. And so my question is, if you were a family, do we go that strong on equally yoked, and does equally yoked mean this an Adventist, or can it mean another Protestant in the Bible? But I don't think that works.
Anybody wants to answer his question?
Well, okay, I'll just,
Yeah. Can we get the mic over here?
alright, I don't know if this answers that, but I'm just gonna go down here, because it's saying that it was, the issue with intermarriage in these commands concerns marrying someone who is of a different faith or of no faith. So the problem was that the people in Ezra and Nehemiah's time did not choose to marry believers in God. That was the problem. They didn't choose to do that. And so these pagan wives in this story did not choose to renounce idolatrous worship. But it tells us here that, Moses married Sephora, Midianite woman, and Boaz married Ruth, but these women, they did not go against God. They were open to it. They were not fighting it. So it's okay. But the other ones, they refused. They fought against it. So I just see a difference there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps anything.
Just to continue to add some thoughts, in there's a point where it says that, it's kind of a demonstration that this was these were individuals who were going through a period, as maybe we all do at one time or another, that we have a lesser dedication to God. And so, to answer one of your questions, Sister Madison, early on, is that, what could be done is that obviously the parents could provide counsel, and the individual would prayerfully proceed. But it's a tough situation, as we all know, because if the parents are if the parents are too harsh, then they could drive that individual away and into rebellion. But I think that's just what I wanted to point out in response to your question. It's still up to the individual, and all the lead them to wanna have a higher dedication.
And then Bob had his hand raised.
I just wanted to suggest that when we look at how we can look at all these examples that have been given to us and how they can apply to us today, is that, you know, God, as I said before, he's not arbitrary in making rules up and ideas. He's given it to us for our own good, and we know if some of us haven't experienced it firsthand in our own lives, those of us who are older, there are other people that we have to know who, you know, have entered into relationships and marriages where they're unequally yoked. And I think today, although back then it was just either you believed in the God of, you know, of Israel, you know, God of the universe, or you were one of the pagans who had their own false ideas of who God was. But I think today, even looking at it, you know, even underneath the umbrella of Christendom, there are so many different denominations that vary so wildly in their understanding that you can't even really marry someone like that either. And in so doing, even if you do marry someone, I think that as you enter into a relationship with someone, it's important, even if someone was Adventist. And not all Adventists are Adventists. Okay, we know that. And not all the people that claim to worship God, their hearts are not completely right with him. And God knows that. We might not know at the time. So it's important, I think, in principle, to really, have a lot of, for those who are looking to enter into relationships, they need to really be discerning and asking for God's help you discern whether this other individual who you want to enter into a covenant with is someone who is actually is willing to, humble enough to keep learning and growing and studying, and not be someone who is only, wearing their religion as a placard. Okay?
Go ahead.
One point I wanted to add, I slipped my mind when I was talking, is that the parents, because of the years of life that they had and the perspective that they had, can, kind of bring up the unintended consequences and the difficulties that that could arise in this situation that might not otherwise arise, just to bring them to that individual's mind, so that it can be considered.
And then we have one more hand over here, Caroline.
Yes, I was agreeing with everyone that has spoken here, and and kind of an answer to Larry's question or comment there, that we all have had, many of us have had either experience in our family or observed the problems that happen when people are unequally yoked. One of my sons got married to, and he was happy that she was a Christian, and that it's working out all right, but it took a while for her to get open about Seventh-day Adventist, and she doesn't know everything about it, so there's a lot of learning and misunderstanding, but as I say, things are working out. And then I know I met a couple at one of the camp meetings who met each other through a dating, Adventist dating, but fortunately they both came into the program or into this message. They found it together and agreed on it. So that's wonderful. I mean, Jim and I came together and had the same kind of mindset, and so it's worked out that we are both in the message together. But it would be very difficult to have a partner that wasn't. And I think the main point I want to make though is at this particular time in history, we only have a few years till Christ returns. I mean, I think Parmender and other people have said that it's less time than we even think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's more important than ever to be yoked with people who
Yeah.
are of the same mindset in this message.
Amen.
Any other thoughts before we move on? Roman?
I think while it is essential and important to look at principles for literal marriages, I think we shouldn't lose fact also the spiritual lesson,
Mm-hmm.
and which is of
Mm-hmm.
receiving false doctrines which corrupt our faith, and I think in some ways that is more dangerous,
Mm-hmm.
and because it can affect a whole church without the church even being
Yeah.
cognizant of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I just
Mm-hmm.
want to
Amen.
add that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. David?
Thank you, Roman, because this is the line I've been thinking on is, what is it for us?
Mm-hmm.
And it was protection for the church back then, so it must be some kind of protection for the church here and now.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking at, Isaiah 28 talks about the stammering lips and another tongue. They didn't understand the language back then because they were idolaters. I'm not saying that our past people have been idolaters, but our language is different than the Seventh-day Adventist language. Our methodology is different. And so by holding fast to the things, it's the advancing light right now, that we keep the church pure. And I think that, when you think of the woman being a symbol of the church and this whole thing, I know it's the men's are asking the ladies to be married, for marriage, but I think the symbolism there can be shown that it's intermarrying false doctrines, and we know this in the Adventist church. It's been all through, so I like that
Yeah.
prophetic lessons that are coming out there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roland.
Yeah.
Alright, we'll move on to Tuesday. And if I could get somebody to read Ezra 9 verses 1 and 2. Roman?
Ezra 9:1. Now when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the lands, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, and the Amorites. For they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers hath been chief in this trespass.
And we'll look at how Ezra responded once he heard about the intermarriages and the fact that they had not separated as they were told to do so. And if we could have someone read Ezra 9 verse 3.
Ezra 9 verse 3, and when I heard this thing, I rent my garment and my mantle, and plucked off the hair of my head and of my beard, and sat down astonished.
So how does Ezra respond to hearing about the Israelites' intermarriages? Anyone? we'll go down to the second paragraph, the beginning of it. In his study of the causes leading to Babylonish captivity, Ezra had learned that Israel's apostasy was largely traceable to the mingling with heathen nations. He had seen that if they had obeyed God's command to keep separate from the nations surrounding them, they would have been spared many sad and humiliating experiences. And with this, he had rent his garments. We had read in, I think it was verse 3, in astonishment of what the Israelites were doing. And then, could I have someone read the last paragraph on that page? Starts with the word separate.
The word separate is used for contrasting entities. In fact, it denotes complete opposites. By this statement, the people acknowledged a prior understanding and knowledge of God's command to stay away from false religions. They understood that no one could say that he or she will marry a spouse whose contrasting beliefs will have no impact on the marriage relationship or how they raise their children. They realized how serious the situation had become.
Thank you. Does anyone have any thoughts on this lesson? So,
Well, I'm not, this isn't probably very much of a contribution, but I just found it kind of interesting about that he rent his own garment and pulled his own hair out, and I think that was mentioned before, but and we've seen it in our lessons before too, and I think it's interesting that he would do that to himself rather than strike out at some other person. I don't know where that comes from, because I don't really know that much about Judaism and their practices, but I just thought that was pretty interesting.
yeah. Oh, Dave.
I had the same thought, and I think he was like chastising himself before anybody else. Like in Daniel's prayer, he's saying the sins we have committed, and he's saying, and he's leadership, he's saying, man, we're messed up, and I'm going to start with myself. And I think that's a lesson for all of us.
Yeah. Anyone else before we move on? Bob?
I agree with everything that's been said about him taking it to be first. He was a leader, and I think he expected better of the other leaders that were there. And we know specifically, because in Ezra chapter 9 verse 2, I think it says that the people who were the principal violators of this principle were the leaders. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I mean, Satan knows how men operate, and he knows that we're followers, tend to be followers, and he knows that if he can influence the leadership, he can influence the whole lot. And so I think that when people are in positions of leadership, that they are actually more vulnerable to Satan's attacks than those who are not in positions of leadership. And so that just beckons that we need to be praying for the leaders that God has raised up today. And if we understand what God is doing in this movement, for each one of us, he's actually bringing us from a position where we don't even know what we don't know, and he's teaching us there's a lot that we don't understand correctly, and we have to unlearn things that we learned from the past and learn the truth. And once we learn that truth, the truth beckons us, the Lord is beckoning us to actually become leaders as well, and become teachers. And so I think it's really important for us to realize how important it is for us to be lifting all of each other up in prayer, because that's the direction that God is taking this movement, is for us to be able to be leaders and to be those who are going to be raised up when it comes to harvesting of the Levites and the Nethinims. And yeah, and I just also wanted to add that when you look at Nehemiah, I think that it also, not only was it a display that he was trying to take it to himself first, but I think also it just showed the magnitude, because he was walking close with God. And I think because he was a leader and he could do that and other people would see what he was doing, it actually exemplified the fact that he was grieved beyond measure with what he saw, what was going on, because of how bad it was.
Yeah, thank you for that thought. And we'll move on to Wednesday. And if some of us had read through Ezra 10 as it says, the question would be, how did Ezra and the leaders tackle the issue of intermarriage? Cam?
They sent them away, the strange
Mhm.
ones.
Yeah.
They all, and amazingly, there was quite a few who, most all of them did, decide to send their wives away.
Yeah.
And
It talks about that in the first part. I'll just read over that. Together, the whole assembly decided to send the foreign wives away. Amazingly, even those who married them agreed with the plan, except for the 4 men mentioned by name in Ezra 10:15. The Jews promised to send their spouses away, and it took 3 months for the plan to be carried out. In the end, 111 Jewish men sent their wives away. And then another interesting bit that I have highlighted here is if you go down to the beginning of the second paragraph, the specific words used in Ezra 10 verses 11 and 19 for separate yourself and put away are not used anywhere else in the scriptures for divorce. Ezra would have known the terminology regularly used for divorce, but he chose not to use it. Thus, it is apparent that they were in violation of the Torah command. In other words, the marriages were nullified because they were contrary to the law. So they were invalid. He didn't view them even as a marriage. So I just found that a little interesting. And if anyone has anything to share on this one that they'd like to add. Larry?
When I was in the conference church and with lessons similar to what we're studying, the question sometime came up one time, can God forgive divorce? Because if 2 Adventist couples are if a married person is in the Adventist faith and there's a divorce, and sometimes, as we all know, this still happens, can God forgive that if it's not with the laws where God says you can divorce? And so sometimes, I remember I brought that up too. Can God forgive that? Can you remarry? And sometimes the life is way better. I saw it even in the conference church or something. So that's my question again.
Does anyone have any thoughts?
I never been divorced, so I don't know.
Sure, yes.
Well, I don't have a response to his comment. I just wanted to add, the first sentence of the last paragraph points out that over time, however, the Jewish men once again began to marry unbelievers. So we can see there was backsliding after this.
And I think your question ties into the next day. If you want, we can move on to that Thursday. And we'll look at Paul's perspective of marrying outside the faith. And if I could have someone read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 17. takers. Roman?
And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or a sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? But as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all churches.
Amen.
Thank you. And then, just to highlight, the question here is, how should we approach marriages that are unequally yoked today? If anyone has anything to add to that? Not all. I have this first paragraph I'm going to read from. Because we have no elaborate command in the Bible on what to do with interfaith marriages, it would be very unwise and run against the intention of the text and its principles to insist that separating from the unbelieving spouse is the right approach, and based on this account by Ezra must be recommended. Ezra and Nehemiah's situation was a one-time event and according to God's will. And because the future and worship of the whole community of Israel was at risk, they were losing their identity as worshipers of a living God. And I'm going to jump down to the middle of the next paragraph. This one-time event shouldn't be taken as a prescription for the breaking up of marriages and families whenever a believer marries an unbeliever. Jump down to the next paragraph. While the Bible clearly counsels against unequally yoked marriages, we also find passages of extended grace to those who have made a different choice. So I think that kind of answers your question a bit. Mary. Bob?
I just wanted to add, if you look at people who do, marry and they're unequally yoked, if, as Paul rather eloquently explains it, if they're willing to work with each other and be at peace with each other, and, we all exhibit a profound influence on one another for good or for evil at all times. And if we can, if someone's finding themselves in that situation, and they can be, depending on whether the man or the woman, if they can be a godly influence and they can live at peace in the home with each other, and I say that relatively because every marriage has its ripples, but I know that it's important to realize that there's a spirit that they can work together and come together. Then the end of it is that they end up being equally yoked. And so if things are moving in that direction, and I know this will be something you can't just judge in a moment, it takes a lot of time, and many years, in fact, at times, but I know that it's important for people to be able to do that. But I think that if you have a situation where you have a spouse that is openly defiant and is making the home life absolutely miserable in every way, and it goes on for years, then I think that that's when separation is actually warranted, and God actually would be behind it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Rowan?
I just, now I could be completely wrong in my take on this, but I'll just throw it out there, but it seems kind of interesting. In 1 Corinthians, the passage we just read, chapter 7, verse 12, the first part, Paul says, "But to the rest speak I, not the Lord." And so he says he's the one speaking, not God. But I don't know if or he could be looking back at, that the pretty plain counsel to separate from unrighteous wives. But now I think seems he's recognizing progression and context and the time and it's a different situation, but he's not destroying the underlying principle though.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you. And we have a hand back here, Andrea.
I think it kind of goes along with what Roman said. I like that at the end it mentioned you can't use what was said in Nehemiah, as a prescription or as like a blanket statement for everything. And I think that's a big thing we're learning in general in this message. A lot of us in this message, and I want to be clear, I'm not blaming the movement or the message itself. That's separate, that's perfect. It's just the way the human has grasped it, how it has interpreted everything. Humanity, and not every person, has made so many mistakes in terms of how they have grasped this message and given it to others in terms of they read something and it's just a blanket statement and it's just like that prescription applies to absolutely every human and it must be that way and it's this cookie cutter formula and here it has to just, it's not going to conform to you or your life or your experiences or just even the person you are. You're just going to have to cram yourself into that space and make it work. And I just really appreciate that note at the end that it said that because that just speaks so much to us right now where, anything, and I say this carefully, I don't say this flippantly or in a way to make anyone uncomfortable whatsoever, but say for everything, the health reform, dress reform, there's principles that are eternal, right? There's principles that are eternal. But there's say how those principles are manifested may be different. It may be that, yes, for you, beans all the way, yes, we know that's a great protein source, but perhaps this person can't subsist on those and maybe they need, I don't know, maybe they need eggs in their diet. I'm not trying to offend anyone, I'm just saying, we don't, to make a blanket statement just wouldn't be fair. Or just with anything, absolutely anything. And I just wanted to highlight that I appreciate that it mentioned that. But again, I'm not trying to be offensive or anything. I'm just saying, maybe we should consider these things more, maybe instead of assuming, oh, see, that person has already failed in the health message or in country living, whatever, because they're not how I want them to look. That's not fair because you don't know the circumstances of their life.
Yeah.
Amen.
Thank you for that. Oh, there.
When Brother Bob spoke, he says that every marriage has ripples. I would say that there's some marriages that have waves, but one counsel I would say that helped me. I don't know if it helped, but the best logic I heard about marriage was when it comes to that point, whether you're male or female, is your choice going to take yourself closer to the Lord or further away? And that was the best logic or best counsel that I had that brothers or sisters gave to me in the church.
Yeah. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add? Or as we move on? Alright, we'll go to Friday. And I'm just gonna go down to this first question. As we read these stories, it seems clear that many of the people weren't dedicated to God in the first place, which is why they chose pagan lives. Thus, Ezra doesn't want to leave them to their own devices, but attempts to reprove and correct them in hopes of achieving change. Did the change truly occur, though? By changing their behavior, did they change within? Did their devotion to God truly grow? What evidence do we have that many of them didn't really change? And what can we learn from their mistakes about how important a change of heart really is?
Amen.
If anyone has anything they would like to add. Bob?
That statement pretty much sums it up very well.
Yeah.
The only thing I could try to add is just to reiterate it, that if God has your heart, He has all of you. And that's why God tells us to seek Him with our whole heart. Because if our heart is divided, if our heart has its affections set on Him and on the world, then we're really not completely His, and that's going to make us, to stumble and to make us, drift further away. And I would go as far as to say this, when we look at Christ, when He was on the earth and the devil was doing everything in his power to trip Christ up, Jesus could look him in the face and say, "You have nothing in me." And the reason why is because he did not veer from God's precepts, from His principles in any way, even in the slightest way. And I recognize for myself personally, if I look at some of the mistakes that I've made in my life and the trouble that I have had, that the devil has caused me personally, I realize that it's because there are things where in my own thinking I rationalized or was willing to in some way compromise on some of the principles that God has. And it really is a principle that we have to give God our whole heart, because if our heart is still divided, then that basically, put it succinctly, it gives leverage to the devil to cause us trouble in all different ways. So I can see the importance of us just being able to humble ourselves completely before the Lord and want to allow nothing to get between us and our Savior.
Yeah, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add before we close? If not, could I ask Richard to have closing prayer?
Father Heaven, Lord, we thank you for this opportunity, Lord, to study your word. Lord, we thank you for giving us the methodology that we have, Lord, to recognize, Lord, when you speak to us and the different time settings in which those words need to be interpreted, Lord, so that we can apply them correctly. And Lord, we thank you so much for everything you've done for us, Lord. And we pray that you will continue to pour out your light rain on us today. We thank you and we ask these blessings in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.